So in this table, okay, we can summarize, if you want, several de-risking categories. If we talk first about policy de-risking, so on the short term, for example, we can update the grid code for renewable energy. On the medium term, we can have building skills and expertise in grid management. And in long term, we can work on strengthening physical grid infrastructure. If we talk about, let's say, financial de-risking strategies, for a short-term period, we can work on providing direct public loans to develop to projects that are renewable. On the medium term, we can provide guarantees for commercial loans, engaging local financial sector. And on the long term, we can reach ideally standalone commercial loans that are specific for renewable energy. Another example is the direct financial incentives by, as we discussed before, on short term, we can adopt tax-based incentives. In medium term, we can phase out of fossil fuels subsidies. And on long term, we'll have ideally no renewable energy incentives because renewable energy will be de-risked and competitive. So as we mentioned before, for example, when we took the case of implementing PV, at the first stage, the cost of PV was really large, okay, because it was a new technology and the cost of fossil fuels was relatively low. So no one will invest if you don't have incentives or if you don't have policies from government. That's why in the first period, a government had to put regulations to force people to use such systems. They also imposed taxes on CO2 emissions, and this helped the introduction of PV in the market. In the medium stage, because of the development in technologies, we were able to reduce a lot the cost of PV to be competitive with fossil fuels. And at the final stage, the final goal will be to completely replace fossil fuels by projects relying on renewable energy. So whenever we reach the final goal, we can say then that de-risking is complete because now renewable energy is attractive without any forced regulations because the cost of implementation was really reduced. Plus, we are able to have high gains whenever we study the CER of this project. It will allow us to gain a lot of money. So we will go to renewable energy without any motivation or regulations because renewable energy itself has progressed a lot with technological advancements and reduction in cost of implementation. Okay, so here we are talking about public instruments. Okay, so as we mentioned, we have different instruments, and for each type of instruments, we can develop what we call the de-risking waterfall. Okay, let us take a de-risking example here. So let us talk, let's say, about implementing public instruments in order to reduce, sorry, the risk attributed to a certain project. So first, as we said, we should determine the most important public de-risking instrument that will help us into reducing the risk associated with a certain project. In another step, we should quantify the impact of the public de-risking instrument and also quantify the public cost of these instruments. So we can go and do as we did before. We do a small table. We determine what are the main, if you want, de-risking techniques. So let's say we have instrument 1, instrument 2, instrument 3. And we want to construct what we call the post de-risking waterfall. So here we'll do exactly the opposite calculations that we did before. So we consider, if you want, the initial state. So let's say, example, I will give you in numbers. Let's say in the current state, I have a total risk, for example, of 20%. Okay. And I want to impose some de-risking strategies. And I hope that by implementing these two instruments, instrument 1 and instrument 2, my final aim is to reduce the risk to 10%, for example. Okay. So what I should do, I should determine, to determine which weight I should give to each instrument, I will construct a table. So let's say instrument number 1, instrument number 2. And I should do some statistics and ask questions, okay, in order to ask first about the probability of implementing this instrument. So do I have a high chance of implementing this instrument? And for example, let us consider the case of loans. If we can impose, for example, on banks to give loans to renewable energy projects. So you want to see if the government has high influence on banks or not. Okay, so if it has a high influence on banks, so we'll have a high probability to implement this instrument. If not, we should look at other strategies. Okay, so it depends, of course, on the country, on the owner of banks, on the economical situation of the country, etc. So it depends, if you want, on the overall conditions where we want to implement the project. So we have to ask for the probability of implementing the instrument, which will lead to reduction of risks. And we should ask also of the impact of this instrument. Yani, do you consider, for example, that imposing on banks to give loans, high loans to renewable energy project will help into reducing the risk? Of course, yes. And this is one of the best financial instruments that we can have, because one of the main limitation of renewable energy is the high initial investment. So whenever we can encourage loans from banks, and this will reduce, of course, the cost of capital, the total cost, because we know that always the risk, the discount rate relative to debit is smaller than the one relative to equity. So this, of course, will have a good impact on the de-risking the project. So we put scores, okay, and scores can be of variable scale. Yani we took the previous example, we put score from 1 to 5. I can tell you I am putting scores, let's say, from 1 to 10. Okay, so example, let us say that whenever we answered the question, okay, the probability, for example, of instrument 1 was the average grade was 7/10, and the impact, let's say, was 8/10. Okay, while for instrument 2, for example, we have a probability of 5, but an impact of 9, for example. And now we want to determine the percentage of reduction in risk for each instrument. So first we should compute now the score for each part. So just as we mentioned, for the score, we multiply the score of probability by the score of impact. So we have first 7 times 8, which is 56, and 5 times 9, which is 45. So the total score will be 101. Okay. And now we say then that the weight that should be given to instrument 1 in the de-risking procedure is 56/101, while the weight that should be given to instrument 2 is 45/101. So now, if I want to determine for each instrument what will be the reduction in risk, I say when I implement de-risking instrument 1, I can reduce the total risk by 20. I should do the difference between 20 and 10. So 10% times 56/101. Okay, so this will give me the percentage of reduction of risk by implementing strategy 1. And to get the reduction by implementing instrument 2, I just have to do 10 times 45/101. And of course, if I add these two percentages, I will get 10%. Yes, any question on this?
I have a question.
Yes, Hilda.
So in the probability, why didn't we take it less than 1? Why are we taking it greater than 1?
No, it's not. It's a score, Hilda. Okay, it's a score out of 10. يعني you are putting a score from 1 to 10. 10 is highly probable. Okay, it's not a percentage. This number is not the probability percentage. If I ask you, for example, do you consider that? So you go and ask the groups and parties affected by the project. You ask them, do you consider that implementing this strategy has a high probability? So it is simple. In case you have several barriers to this instrument, you can say, I think it's difficult to implement this strategy, so I can put a score of 2 over 10. But if it's a high probable strategy to implement, I put a score that is close to 10. So it's just a score, and I will tell you what is the scale. And at the end, you are normalizing scores because you are dividing by the total score. So you can say put a score from 1 to 10. You can tell the person you ask put a score from 1 to 5. But you should unify, and you will unify the score, let's say, for both questions.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay, welcome.
بس مس انت بتعطينا البروبابيلتي السكورز
اكيد
او
انا I will give you enough information. يعني أنا for example I might give you questions to people and I give you the grades and I tell you based on the result of the questions construct this post de-risking waterfall diagram, knowing that initially you have a risk of 20%, so and the final risk is, let's say, 15%, for example. Determine for each instrument of de-risking what will be the corresponding reduction in risk.
بس ال 10 وال 15 يعني هيدا ال 5%
اكيد هيدي
كيف
انا بدي
حتكون؟
اعطيك اياها اكيد. ما انت look انت you put a final aim. يعني your aim is to reach this, but to reach this you need to implement several strategies. okay
اوكي بس انا قصدي انه where are we taking into account هيدا ال 5% اللي هي
ما
difference
انت
between them؟
بتاخدها هون وقتها بدك تجيب قد ايه نزل الريسك. when you want to estimate the reduction in risk associated with this instrument بدك تعمل 20 minus 15
اوكي خلص عرفت كيف تعمل percent الدي
difference.
ريسكينج over
يعني
total
هيدا الويت
اوكي
بدك تضربه بالديفرنس between the initial risk and the final risk.
اوكي deal thanks.
Okay. So here, for example, we are considering an example where we considered different risk categories. And for example, the power market risk, what can be the policy de-risking instruments that can be implemented? You can have a long-term, legally binding renewable energy targets. You can have establishment of an enabling regulatory framework. You can have independent regulator for power sector, etc. So these are some de-risking policy de-risking strategies that are relative to power market risk category. If we consider another example, let's say, of permits risks, so you have streamlined process for renewable energy permits. So as discussed before, any project might need confirmation to start. So we can give some incentives by simplifying the rules and the procedure, the time that will take place in order to start with a project. So we can give several simplifying measures to help installing renewable energy projects. If we consider, for example, social acceptance risk by considering awareness raising campaigns and stakeholder outreach, including operators of private generators. We can also, if we consider, let's say, as a financing risk category, we can talk about fostering financial sector reform towards green infrastructure investment and strengthening financial sector's familiarity with renewable energy and project finance. So for each risk category, we have several instruments that can help into reducing the total risk that we have. Now, if we apply this to levelized cost of electricity that we discussed before. So the first step will be to calculate the levelized cost of electricity for the baseline energy mix. The second step will calculate the LCOE for the renewable energy investment for both the pre and post de-risking financing cost, and derives the incremental cost gap between the renewable energy and baseline. So what do we mean by this? If we take the example of Lebanon, okay, we know that Lebanon is a country under development and we have a high number of barriers. That's why for the current state, we have a high risk factor. Then we try to compare it with the best scenario in which we have, let's say, a very low risk, and we try to implement several instruments in order to have a risk profile similar to the best in developed countries. Okay, so this is the overall picture. So as we said, we should go through all steps, and we should first calculate the LCOE for the baseline energy generation mix in the particular country. Then we should quantify the LCOE for renewable energy investment. Then we should decide what are the pre-de-risking and post-de-risking scenarios in order to calculate the incremental cost or savings by comparing these scenarios versus the reference one. So for example, if we consider here, let's say some calculations, okay, we can, if we consider the baseline activity, let's say using coal, diesel, oil, or hydropower, and in overall we can determine a certain amount of USD per kilowatt hour. We do the same calculation for renewable energy. It's clear that before doing de-risking strategies, the initial cost of renewable energy is high compared to the reference case, which is, let's say, diesel oil or hydro or coal or combination of these. So we can combine several strategies, but all of these, for example, implementing diesel oil is not very encouraged. So we try to reduce the use of fossil fuels. So, but what is the advantage of using fossil fuel, as we know, is the relatively low price of USD per kilowatt hour. This is why we can say our final aim is to be competitive with this price. Okay, so we want to try to have measures to reach this price at least, or to be competitive with it. Even if you have a price that is a little bit larger than the case of the one using diesel oil, you might say it's fine for us, it's acceptable because of the large advantages that we have from renewable energy.